once again, thank you. And the episode that we are making is about social media and the addictiveness and the design, intuitive design that is made by all the companies in order to trick us and make us spend more time on those social media. And my first question would be the following, that our brain didn't evolve for this hyperstimulation that we can experience right now. So how does our brain react differently to all those distractions, hyperstimulation of the social media, and how it affects us and how it causes the addiction? That would be my first question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that, our brain, did evolve for us to approach pleasurable stimuli and avoid painful stimuli. And that's sort of deeply embedded and highly conserved over millions of years of evolution and across species. But this system in our brain is really hardwired for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. And the kinds of rewards that we, have evolved to seek out, things like food, clothing, shelter, finding a mate, have through most of human existence required tremendous effort. So first there was this output of effort involving movement. Movement is also intimately connected to dopamine, a chemical that our brain makes and releases. So there's this movement, this effort, this interacting with the environment in order to get food, clothing, shelter, a mate. And then the release of even more dopamine when, we finally get that reward, followed by a kind of return to baseline and then looking for the next reward, just basically in order to survive. But we are now surrounded by highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors in many different forms, available at the touch of a finger or the swipe of a hand, without having to get even up off the couch. And the amount of dopamine that our environmental stimuli now releases without effort is much, much more than our primitive brains were evolved to tolerate. And the result is that our brains are kind of reeling, just sort of like, it's like a fire hose of reward. And in order to compensate for that, we essentially have to downregulate our own endogenous or innate dopamine production, along with other feel-good hormones like serotonin, norepinephrine, our endocannabinoid system, our endo-opioid system. And the result is that we're sort of then in this chronic dopamine deficit state. We're essentially experiencing clinical depression, anxiety, restlessness, intrusive craving, precisely because we are constantly being bombarded by these feel-good drugs and behaviors.
Thanks so much. Before our interview, I looked up whether the such diagnosis as social media addiction exists, and as far as I found, that it's not classified in DSM-5, even though, like, for instance, in the Royal Society report that I found for 2015, they actually connected a lot of the depressions with social media. So I have a couple of questions. Is social media addiction somehow different from other addictions, from alcohol, drug addiction, or gambling, gaming, and so on? And why it's not yet classified as such, as a separate kind of addiction?
So, social media addiction is the same as other addictions. That's my belief. That basically all of these substances and highly reinforcing behaviors, whether it's cannabis, alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, heroin, video games, pornography and compulsive masturbation, social media, shopping, they all work on the same dopamine reward pathway. Sorry, they all work on the same dopamine reward pathway, and they've all been drugified in the modern era. That is to say that technology has allowed them to become more accessible, more abundant, more potent, and more novel. So those are 4 key characteristics that make something addictive. The reason that they're not yet classified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is because I think it's just taking the field a while to catch up to the reality of our existence. The only behavioral addiction, that is to say, an addiction that's not related to a substance that we ingest, the only behavioral addiction in the DSM-5 is in fact gambling addiction. So even, pornography and sex addiction has not yet made it into the DSM-5. Interestingly, according to the World Health Organization, gaming disorder or video game disorder is a classifiable, diagnosable addiction. But again, video game addiction is not yet in the DSM-5. So I think it's going to take some time before this subcategory of what we call behavioral addictions or process addictions makes it into the DSM-5. But I'm quite certain that it will eventually make it there, because the natural history of becoming addicted to behaviors is identical to the natural history of becoming addicted to drugs or alcohol. People start out typically for 2 reasons: to have fun or to solve a problem. And that problem can be wide ranging, anything from boredom to anxiety to depression to insomnia, to you name it. If it works for that individual, they will repeat that behavior. And over time, they will need more of the substance to get the same effect and more potent forms to get the same effect. They'll eventually progress till they're using either daily or on an intermittent binge level, where when they do use, even if it's maybe just weekly or monthly, they have kind of a bender. And then ultimately it will lead to consequences. And the consequences are many, but one of the significant consequences is, again, this dopamine deficit state, which is experienced as anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use, otherwise known as craving.
I wanted to ask you about all the persuasive designs that a company are using. So it seems like those companies are using our brain's backdoors in order to get us to use social media more, like fear of missing out, and never-ending social media threads, or our likes that release this sense of worthiness, or the push-up notifications, A/B testings, and so on. Could you explain a little bit what are those vulnerabilities of our brain that are mostly used by the companies against us, if we can say so?
Yeah, so I would start on the meta level. I shouldn't use that word meta. Now you can't use the word meta anymore. Anyway, on a big picture, 30,000-foot view, I would say that it's important to recognize that the screen itself is reinforcing. And I think that this is maybe akin to kind of like a primitive fire, where we're just naturally drawn to these kinds of flickering lights. And people are drawn to the screen. The devices themselves, the way they kind of engage our motor movements, the kind of tapping and swiping, almost as if we're actually doing some productive work that's been deeply ingrained over, millions of years, maybe, of picking berries or harvesting or grinding wheat. So I think that's important. Like the thing itself is rewarding. And then, of course, there's the things that we get to, whether it's another human being. And of course, that's the heart of the social media piece of it, that ultimately we are nominally, seeking out human connection. We genuinely are seeking out human connection. We are wired for human connection, right? We get a little hit of dopamine when we make a human connection. That includes when people like us, when they regard us highly, when we experience the same emotion as somebody else at the same time, or even bigger yet, the same emotion as millions of other people at the same time. So we get dopamine when we make that human connection. The problem is that both the medium itself and the ease and access and potency of making those human connections online has turned what was fundamentally a healthy activity into a drug. And as you mentioned, some of the ways that that happens is this, as I said, quantity. So if you're using cocaine, you're going to run out of lines at some point. You're going to have to go out and get some more. But TikTok is infinite, right? And then you have access. You've got now your smartphone, 24/7 digital dopamine, wherever you go. The bottomless bowls is sort of an example of the endless quantity. The likes have to do with giving something a number. And I think one of the things that we've realized in the modern age, because, enumeration is old, but we enumerate everything now. And for many people, that is highly reinforcing. The number of likes, the number of tweets and retweets, our ranking. We're all like looking at our leaderboards, where's my ranking in my video game? Or for example, when my book Dopamine Nation first came out, I got totally drawn into looking at my ranking on Amazon. How was it selling? Compulsively checking. So these are the types of things that we really get drawn in by. It's kind of that comparison between ourselves and people in our tribe, which, by the way, is, innate and fundamentally, I guess, healthy to do. The problem is that we were hardwired to make comparisons between ourselves and a very small number of other people, maybe, on the order of like 10 to 100 people. Now we're comparing ourselves to the whole world. And that very then quickly leads to this feeling of being less than, or kind of learned helplessness, because no matter what we achieve, there's always somebody who has achieved more, right, online in this world. So I think that then leads to these both the feeling of missing out, like, oh, if I'm not participating, then I'm going to go down in my rankings, but also this feeling of sort of never being enough. And these two things sort of act in an insidious way where we're then compulsively engaged, constantly playing catch up, yet no matter how much time we spend, we're feeling bad about ourselves. The other thing too is, remember, I talked about access, quantity, potency, and novelty. So novelty is really important for releasing dopamine. Dopamine is, in essence, not just a reward, pleasure, and motivation neurotransmitter, but it's a novelty neurotransmitter. It's the neurotransmitter that gets us to pay attention to new things in our environment, which we're very hardwired to do. It's absolutely fundamental to our survival that we are noticing new things in the environment. And what the AI algorithms do is that they pay attention to what we like in the past, and then they offer up something that's similar to that, but a little bit novel. And then we're like, we cannot resist that, because like, oh, I have to check and see. It's that kind of, that treasure hunting function that gets activated and releases dopamine.
That's interesting that you mentioned about you checking the Amazon rankings, because my next question is about that even if you know all the vulnerabilities, you are not immune to all of those. And actually in the Social Dilemma documentary, the one that you took part, there is a short scene with your kids.
Yes.
While they're knowing all of it, obviously, they're still not realizing how much time they're spending online. So basically, what we want to hear, and I'm sure there is no one remedy, but maybe some steps, some things you can do in order to get out of this addiction. And obviously, when it's a critical, there are like four weeks of abstination from what I've read, one of the methods that you use. But maybe when it doesn't get to that critical point, what can be done?
Well, there are lots of things that we can do. The first is to just be aware that these online products are equivalent to drugs, and that they're releasing a whole lot of dopamine in our reward pathway, and that they're innately compulsive, and that we're all sort of struggling now with this problem. And it's a problem worth discussing and worth struggling with. It's not something that we should just say, well, forget it, I'm lost in it. It's really worth working on, because the result of continued compulsive overconsumption, or the relentless pursuit of pleasure for its own sake is actually anhedonia, or the loss of pleasure, which is, I think, where we're all headed. Things that people can do. I do think that the very first thing to do is to take a conscious and intentional and scheduled break from these products. And whether that means deleting a particular app or actually putting away all screens for a period of time, that is the important place to start. Because until we have done that, we are not allowing our brains to recover from the insult of these high dopamine products. But when we take it away, although initially that means that, we're in a dopamine deficit state and feeling worse, if we can just persist in abstaining, we'll eventually start to upregulate our own endogenous dopamine production. And that's really, really important, because that allows us to take pleasure in other more modest rewards, like, things that happen in real life, having a meal with a friend, going for a walk without listening to or watching anything, being able to tolerate and sit with our own, emotions, things that bubble up in our brain. So that's really the first step. And again, I think a way to do that is to schedule it, to do it together with others. That kind of reduces FOMO, a fear of missing out, and to set a specific amount of time. I usually, frankly, recommend 30 days because I do think that's the minimum amount of time it takes to fully reset reward pathways. But if you can't do a month and you can't do a week, at least do 24 hours. 24 hours can also at least begin to reset reward pathways, and also be quite a revelation in terms of the extent to which we've all become addicted. So just putting that phone away for a day, people will notice those intrusive thoughts of wanting to use, thinking about where the phone is, what am I missing? And that in and of itself can be very instructive to realize how much of our mental real estate has now been latticed to be thinking about this phone, and how much we could maybe use that mental real estate for other things potentially. So I think that's really, really important. And then after that period of abstinence, being very conscious and intentional about how we want to go back to using, these online products. And I talk about self-binding strategies. You can use time as a construct. For example, I use intermittent fasting for my digital use, which is to say I try to use for discrete hours in the day, just my work hours. I try not to use before work. I try not to make it be the first thing that I touch in the morning. Really, really hard. But if I can not touch my phone or my laptop first thing and divert my attention to other things like self-care or exercise, then I do stop craving or thinking about it, and I can get out of that loop. And then I delay that first opening. And also I try to make a list. We can make lists of what am I going to do online when I go on my phone or when I open my computer. You could also think about scheduling dedicated time, although limited time, for just doing mindless surfing. That's my entertainment time, just mindlessly scrolling Instagram. I'm going to do that for an hour, and I'm going to, have a discrete time that I get off. But it's sort of consolidated and it's intentional. So time is a construct. We can also have literal barriers, like, for example, making sure that we don't bring our devices into certain rooms in the house that we're trying to make tech-free, or don't bring our devices when we go out walking or running or biking, trying to literally have times when we let our brain just rest. There's a lot of interest now in this default mental resting network as a time of sort of synchrony and integration of the various parts of our brain. But our brain can't do that if we're constantly stimulating it and reacting to external cues. And then finally, there's kind of this categorical binding, which is to say, that's where we say to ourselves, well, I'm going to use this app, but I'm not going to use that app. For example, for me, YouTube is really, I get sucked in by YouTube. And I know that videos like Dr. Pimple Popper, I can't really watch those, because once I start watching them, I just 3-4 hours later, I'm, just watching pus come out of some kind of boil on some stranger's back. Total waste of time. And I don't want to be doing that, but I just sucked in by that. So I really try to avoid things like that, especially alone. If I can get one of my kids in the background to say, Mom, that's gross, why are you watching that? That will help me get off. So things like that. So categorical, like I'm just not going to watch Dr. Pimple Popper. I'm not going to watch. Another one for me is American Idol. I can just like spend hours doing that. So I think thinking about it like that can be helpful.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of our readers who are here. So I have more questions, but I just wanted to pause here and give an opportunity to them. If you want, you can unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can write it in the chat and I will read it out loud. So I'll pause for a second, and if not, then I have more. Okay, if you have a question, just write it down or write your intention. We have one. Can we say that anything that brings pleasure can lead to an addiction?
I think that's correct, right? Anything that brings pleasure can lead to addiction. This is sort of sad, but even things that are like nominally healthy or adaptive or rewarded culturally that give us an intense pleasure can ultimately become an addictive behavior, or even just kind of wear out if we overconsume them. So, again, I talk about in the book, my addiction to romance novels. I've been a lifelong reader, and reading has always been my coping strategy and my escape. But it really wasn't until I got a Kindle and discovered romance novels and then progressed to erotica, essentially pornography, that I really became addicted and was able to eventually observe that behavior in myself. And the sad part is that now I really like reading any kind of novel has lost its appeal to me. Not because I want it to lose its appeal. I keep trying to recreate that feeling and I can't get it. And it's a way in which eventually those neuroadaptation gremlins that hop on the pain side of the balance, they just kind of, we lose resilience. And this happens to so many patients of mine who, for example, smoke weed for decades and it works for them. It helps them sleep, helps reduce anxiety. And then at some point they get to the place where it just stops working. And it only kind of seems to recreate these problems. So I do think that anything that brings that really intense pleasure that we get from sort of escaping, unless it comes from a painful activity. So, but any kind of immediate stimulus that immediately gives pleasure is typically going to be eventually addictive.
I have a question about the influencers. How do they affect? There is a very great discrepancy between the social media life and the actual life, and it brings a lot of stress to the people because they are trapped in this array of photos of the perfect life, and everyone's life isn't perfect. How this affects the mental health of people just publishing the bright side of their life and hiding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the big indicators of mental health is that our insides match our outsides. So when people get to see what we're really experiencing inside, that first of all, that promotes intimacy, and intimacy is a healthy and adaptive source of dopamine when it's earned. When we don't have that, when our insides and our outsides do not match, it can really lead to a powerful feeling of alienation, and that somehow we're not real. And that can lead to tremendous depression and even suicidal thinking. So, and I've seen that in many, many patients who, they curate these online personas that are completely different from their real lives. And they experience, profound depression and anxiety, in part as a result of that gap or that mismatch. Which is why, I do recommend this kind of radical honesty or like radical transparency, especially with the people that we really care about. We have to be careful about doing that with like the millions of online people, because that's a totally different kind of thing. Again, a way to kind of drugify even human honesty. But again, just making sure that the insides and outsides match is really important for mental health. Excuse me.
Thank you so much. We have some more comments. He is saying that your book was life-changing for him. And Maxim has more questions. Why some pleasant things create an addiction, but some other things we have a level of satisfaction when we just get bored of them, like sport games, talking to people, and so on. And how to define a personal healthy amount of social media per day or per week.
Yeah, so I think one important concept about which there's surprisingly little science, but which I know from clinical experience, is this concept of drug of choice or inter-individual variability. So what's reinforcing for one person is not necessarily reinforcing for another. Some people's drug of choice might actually be sports games. I've certainly had patients who got addicted to sports either as a spectator or even as a player themselves, people addicted to music, watching movies. So these things can be addictive if that's your particular drug of choice. But I guess the question more importantly is, why is it right that for one person, some things are addictive, but not other things? Again, I think that's this drug of choice phenomenon that we all sort of have a lock and a key. And when we find that thing that's really transportive for us, whether it's alcohol or romance novels or chocolate cake, that's the thing that we're liable to get addicted to. And we're not necessarily then going to get addicted to those other things, although often those other things can be a primer for our drug of choice. So for example, if you look at the animal studies, and you stick a probe in a rat's brain to measure dopamine levels, and then you put that rat in a cage where they can press a lever for a cocaine, what you find is that when they press the lever and get that bolus of cocaine intravenously, there's a huge release of dopamine in the reward pathway. But interestingly, if you then train the rat to know that when they see a light, they're going to be able to get cocaine from pressing the lever, then they get a little increase in dopamine just from seeing the light. In other words, just being reminded of the reward is rewarding in and of itself. And there's that moment of kind of euphoria. But here's something really fascinating. That mild increase in dopamine is followed by a decrease in dopamine levels, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels. That's that dopamine deficit state. That is the source of craving. So you see the light, you get a little bit of a rush, then you go into a dopamine deficit state, you're craving, and now you're going to work very hard to get to that lever, to press it, to get the bigger reward. Also, interestingly, if when that animal then presses the lever for cocaine, which they've learned will come after they see the light, but then they don't get the cocaine, there's a huge dopamine deficit state that follows, which tells us that when we expect a reward and it doesn't come, dopamine levels go really far below baseline. So there's this inherent learned or expected outcome. How did I get onto that? I'm sorry, I forgot what the question.
It's very actually interesting. I have a personal question. I don't know if it's backed by scientific evidence, but personally, I often, when you were saying about mice, I personally often get more pleasure from anticipating some kind of treat or something than from actually being in the moment and so on. Maybe there is also some scientific backing for that. I think that's right. When we're reminded of our drug of choice, we get a little bit of a rush. And then with repeated exposures to rewards, that rewarding aspect or the amount of dopamine released over time gets less. So I think part of it is that the rush of the expectation is based on our euphoric recall of our very first time or our very first 10 times or our very first 100 times. But if now we're on time 101, when we actually use our drug, it's never as good as we thought it would be. And so then there's this kind of complex disappointment associated with it, which then again fuels the craving. And then we look for more of it or more potent forms of it to try to recreate that original recall. Thank you so much. If we have more questions, there's, I guess, a last chance to ask them to Anna.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good. So Anna, thank you for your previous answers. They were very exciting. So my question would be, there has been an idea circulated recently, maybe like 5 years ago, that addictions are actually mostly psychological, if not like completely psychological. Like there is not even such a phenomenon as physical addiction. So maybe you can explain, tell what is the current status of that, and maybe like actually every addiction can be dealt with psychologically and not through some physical pathways.
Right. So I would say that that's actually been the predominant conceptualization of addiction for most of the last 100 years. And it really starts with a psychoanalyst named Sander Rado, who lived in the early 1900s. He was an acolyte of Sigmund Freud. And he said that really the cause of addiction is that people are trying to self-medicate some kind of underlying psychological problem or psychological trauma. And that if you just find out what that is and deal with that underlying emotional problem, people would stop using their drug of choice. So a couple things about that. So first of all, there are plenty of data showing that that is in fact not true. If you take somebody and you like figure out their underlying psychological problem, or you treat their underlying depression or whatever it is, if they're already addicted, they're not going to stop their addictive behaviors. I'll never forget a patient of mine who said to me, he came to me and he said, I realized I was an alcoholic when I took Prozac and it helped my depression, but I didn't stop drinking, which I just thought was a wonderful way to encapsulate the very biological nature of addiction. Because I will often now, part of the problem is that this whole self-medication hypothesis, or this kind of looking for the trauma to explain the addiction, has become so dominant in our field that people, I think, sometimes waste a lot of time looking for why they're using. Sometimes there's a reason, but a lot of time the reason that we're addicted is because we're addicted. Like there isn't necessarily an underlying reason there. It's a highly biological process that hijacks this highly evolutionarily conserved part of our brain that is reflexive, that can take over in an instant. And you don't really need a reason. There's physiology there that's driving that.
Thank you so much. I have one more. I guess it would be the last question, and we'll end. From Olga? Okay, we have two. We'll try to squeeze them really fast. So, what can we do if social media is deeply connected to our work? So basically, if you're a social media manager and you cannot have this abstinence from social media, is there a way?
So first of all, I want to validate that the way in which social media and these devices are integrated into our professional and personal lives indeed makes them very difficult to abstain from and moderate. So I just want to validate that this is a hard problem for the very reasons that you note. On the other hand, our brains are amazing rationalizers. We're incredible storytellers. We can come up with a story for why we do irrational things in a nanosecond. And one of the most convenient and convincing stories is, I need to do this for my work. One of the ways to really test that hypothesis is to, in fact, take a break from checking the social media. So take a vacation from work, because vacations are things. People can take vacations. They're allowed to do that. They can get coverage, as hard as it can be. And trust me, I know it's hard. I have a very hard time leaving my work, namely my patients, to other people because I worry about them. Who's going to take care of them? No one's going to take care of them as well as I take care of them. Well, that's hogwash. I can go on a vacation. They'll be fine. So there are ways in which we can justify these compulsive behaviors, but really the trick is to literally take a time away and then experience that and go, wow, like my business survived, or this was, it's okay. I can take a break from this, and really force ourselves to do that in order to get more perspective on what aspect of our work really requires us to be engaged at that level, and what aspect is really just a justification for our own compulsive, addictive use. So that's what I would say to that. Hopefully that was a reasonable answer. And then, when we come back, those self-binding strategies, try to say, I'm not going to use until 9 a.m. So consolidate our use around a specific time of day, try to achieve balance.
If we can squeeze one more, I'll ask one more, and then, is it okay?
Yeah, great.
So Sergey is also asking, maybe you can recall one of your one of the examples of your patients coming from a therapy that, and some impressive example who managed to do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like, I tried to, in my book, hold up, examples of people who really got into amazing recovery and were able to do it. But I'll share one example that's not in my book, and I have permission from this young man to share this because it really speaks to the device issue. This was a young man who came in very depressed and suicidal, and his parents expressed that they thought he was addicted to video games. He did not think the video games were a problem. In his mind, he was self-medicating his depression and anxiety with video games. And if I could just give him a pill or do some kind of therapy that would help his depression and anxiety, he was quite convinced that he would just naturally and spontaneously stop playing video games all of his waking hours. And by the way, he had dropped out of school. He was living back at home with parents, really quite debilitated. And as I said, suicidal. But I posited to him that I thought that potentially it was actually the video games themselves that were making him depressed and anxious by constantly bombarding his reward pathway with too much dopamine, leading to this dopamine deficit state that I talk about with the pleasure-pain balance in the book. And that if he could just abstain from video games for a month, that he would feel better. He did not really believe that this would work, but he was desperate and he had nothing better to do. He was living at home with parents, dropped out of school. So he decided to give it a try. He eliminated all screens for a month because he was smart enough to realize that even if he just watched YouTube videos of other people playing video games, that would be like the light in the rat and he would want to play video games. So he put all the consoles away, gave his devices to his parents, came back a month later and felt less depressed and less anxious than he had in many, many years, and really became absolutely convinced that indeed it was the video games that were driving the feelings of despair. So he remained abstinent for a full 3 to 4 months afterwards to consolidate those gains because he was feeling so much better. And then when he returned to playing video games, which he did eventually do, he set some very specific rules up for himself. He said, I'm only going to play on Thursdays and Fridays. I'm only going to play 2 hours a day. I'm never going to play League of Legends because when I play that game, I get sucked in. I'm only going to play with friends. I'm not going to play with strangers because when I play with strangers, I get sucked in. I'm going to have 2 separate laptops, one for schoolwork and one for video games, which is really smart because there's that state-dependent learning where we can get triggered just by the place that we're in. And I'm going to keep very careful and close records. And I'm going to avoid smoking pot because when I smoke pot, I want to play video games and vice versa. So that's how he did it. And he's doing really well. It's now been 3 years or so, and he's continuing to not be depressed and do much better in school and go out and make friends. He had a lot of social anxiety as well, which was contributing to, his avoidance behaviors.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time and for your books and for your answers. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thanks for inviting me.